Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, authors and artists. You are listening to the Starving Artist podcast, hosted by me, Devin Thorpe. I am a independently self-published author of, I've written and published the Bloodbound trilogy, which is a grimdark fantasy series that features werewolf and vampire fantasy. It's kind of like if the Vampire Diaries and Game of Thrones had a baby, as well as I am the author of a science fiction series called The Godkiller Chronicles, which is about 1,000 years in the future. What would happen if an artificial intelligence became sentient, declared itself to be God, and decided to eradicate humanity. And just recently, I have published my first ever comic book, which is titled Demidevil. And none of that is what this episode is about. Today, we are here to talk about the infamous writer's block. And I just want to say a couple things. If you are watching the video version of this podcast, you may notice that I have a ring of sweat around the collar of my shirt, and that is because I just got back from a walk with my dogs, and so don't judge me too much. I'm not like a mess or someone who is not up to date on their hygiene. I just walked 3 miles with my dogs, and I sweat, and did not change my shirt before beginning this podcast. Also, you may notice me looking down while I'm recording this, and that is for two reasons. First, it's because you may notice that when I look up, there is a tremendous glare from my lighting rig in my glasses that makes it, just throws the camera focus off. So, but also I've got all my notes for this podcast written down, and we'll be reading off of them every so often, just to make sure that I don't rant too much and I stay on topic. Anyway, we are here to discuss writer's block. I think anyone who has been writing for a length of time and has tried their hand at writing a novel or a series of novels can relate that writer's block is a very real thing that artists and authors deal with. It's not necessarily the same for artists as it is for authors, but I think just on the whole, if you are an artist, you have experienced a time during your career where you've struggled to finish what you started, to find inspiration in pursuing your craft, or you've experienced a tremendous amount of burnout that has made it difficult to continue doing what you're passionate about. And so in that sense, writer's block is specific to authors, but I think it is a very real form of resistance that all artists experience throughout their endeavors. I don't know what it's called in other forms of art. If you're a painter or a musician, I'm not quite sure what it's called, but for the purposes of this podcast, I'll just be calling it writer's block, because that is how it has manifested in my life when writing novels, comic books, stories in general. So I don't want to waste anyone's time. So I'll go ahead and tell you the 5 tips that I use in my writing career, just in the offset. So if any of these 5 things are things that you have already tried and have not worked for you, I don't want to waste your time. So I'll just go ahead and list them now, and I'll go into greater detail about them later on in this video. Today I'm going to be discussing the 5 tips that I have used in my own writing career to battle actively against writer's block and overcome it. Those 5 tips are utilizing story cubes and writing prompts, working on different stories, going for walks with no stimulus, reading, and switching the medium. Those are the 5 topics I'm going to be talking about, and tools that you can implement in your own writing career or artistic career. If you've already tried to implement those 5 things, then this video may not be as useful for you as it could be for other people. You may choose to stick around to see what I have to say about those 5 things in greater detail, or you may not have tried using a select few or even any of those tools, in which case you may gain a lot of value out of this episode of the Starving Artist podcast. So let's just go ahead and introduce the topic of writer's block. And I wanted to start off with a quote from Julia Cameron. She is the author of, I wish I'd written down, I believe The Artist Way, a book about writing in general and how to pursue that as your passion. But she stated, "You will never be a great artist if you are always afraid of making mistakes." And I think to understand what writer's block is, you have to understand where writer's block comes from. What is it about our minds as humans that ultimately ends up manifesting as this barrier between us and the story or the piece of art, the story we want to tell or the piece of art that we want to create? Because that barrier oftentimes feels real, and it feels like there is nothing we can do to get around it. I mean, there's that children's story, that children's song I remember back in grade school that we used to say, if you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you got to go through it. And quite simply put, there's no better way to phrase the solution to writer's block is, if you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you got to go through it. And a lot of times that is the best way to grapple with writer's block, because the only way through is to constantly endure with it, to acknowledge that you're dealing with it, and then take steps to continue working through it. Because the worst thing you can do when you're experiencing writer's block is to just give up and to say, oh, well, it'll pass with time, therefore I'm just going to let it pass. I'm not going to do anything to try to overcome it. I think taking that passive approach can honestly be a terrible way of dealing with writer's block, because if you're a writer, you know that if you don't write consistently, that is a surefire way for you to forget the story that you're trying to tell, to forget the plot points that you had in mind when you started the story, to forget the direction you were planning on taking the story, to forget certain character traits. You'll forget how your characters are supposed to walk, talk, and act in any given situation if you don't write consistently. If you don't spend time with these characters on a frequent basis, it's like going years without seeing your friends. The best analogy that I can use in this same vein is I ran an Ironman 70.3, a half Ironman. That consisted of a 1.2 mile swim, a 50-something mile bike ride, and a half marathon, which is 13.1 miles. And I remember when I was training for this race, I had to swim and I've always enjoyed swimming, but I've never done it competitively, and I've never done it timing myself or trying to get better at it and become faster at it. And it wasn't until I started training swimming on a day-to-day basis, as well as running, is you can progress in swimming and running if you remain consistent and you do it on a daily basis and you incorporate it and prioritize it in your schedule. But for whatever reason, if you take a couple days off from swimming or running and then you return to it a few days later, it'll feel like you've never swam or run in your whole entire life. I don't know, a lot about anatomy or the sciences in that sense, but your aerobic threshold, just if you don't work on it consistently, then it not only will it decrease, but it'll reach a level where it feels like you've never expended or tried to better it ever in your life. That's the best way I can explain writing. If you don't do it on a consistent basis, then you'll start to forget everything. You'll start to forget the reason why you even wanted to tell this story in the first place. Now, that varies for certain people as to how long it takes. Some people will start to forget that kind of stuff if they go a week without writing. Other people have a better memory, and it'll take a month without writing until they start to forget that stuff. But writer's block is this barrier that presents itself, and if you do not work through it, if you don't continue to push yourself and write consistently, then it will make you forget the reason why you started writing the story or where the direction you were taking it in. So that's my introduction to writer's block. I'm sure that I didn't really need to introduce it as a topic, because if you're watching this video, then you know probably exactly what it is, and you're really just here for the solutions. In which case, I will jump into solution number 1, which is utilizing story cubes and utilizing writing prompts. See if I can get it to focus. This is story cubes. I am not endorsed by any company that makes these story cubes. I don't have an affiliate link or anything. I'm simply mentioning this just because it's something that I've implemented in my own career, and I have found it to be effective in helping me overcome writer's block. So I will open this up and try to get it. I'll try to show it to you. Sorry, I'm trying to get the camera to focus. These are story cubes. This is my first tip to overcoming writer's block. When you order story cubes, it'll show up in this little box, and it shows up with 9 cubes. There's all these different genres of story cubes that you can order, but essentially it comes with 9 dice, and these dice, I'll pull one out just so that you can see what it looks like a little bit closer. But these dice each of them has 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 sides. Probably should have known that before I started recording. And the camera focused in. They each have 6 sides, and each side has a different picture or emblem, image, just in general. And so what you do is you take all of the dice, or just a couple of the dice. There's really no, method on how to do it. It's really just up to you as the user. But I typically will roll all 9 of the dice and basically just go off of the images that land face up. So you do it as a way of stimulating your creativity, because oftentimes that is the best way to work your way through writer's block. You don't have to necessarily continue to work on the story that you are experiencing writer's block with. And that's my second tip, which is working on a different story. But while on the topic of story cubes, you roll these 9 dice, and all 9 will land face up with a different image. That image could be a character, it could be an object, it could be a setting, and it's kind of like a Mad Lib. You just plug and play with these different objects and characters and settings to tell a story. And it can be a silly story, it can be a serious, emotional story, it can be humorous, it can be anything you want it to be. And this is the best way to kind of exercise your creativity with nothing at stake. To write as though no one is watching, because no one is watching when it comes to utilizing story cubes and using, writing prompts that you find online. Okay, sorry about that. My camera ended up cutting off right in the middle of my sentence, and I have no idea where I left off. So I'm just going to summarize point number 1 by saying story cubes are a great way to exercise your creativity, because there's no longer anything at stake in your writing. You can be as serious or whimsical as you want to be, and it's not going to mess up the story that you are currently working on, that you're facing writer's block over. Sometimes taking that burden off of yourself so that there's really nothing at stake is all it takes to get the creative juices flowing again. And you don't just have to utilize, story cubes. Going online and looking up random writing prompts is just as helpful and is completely free. Just Google, creative writing prompts, and you can find plenty of websites that have hundreds of them. Find one that piques your interest and just write. Write like nobody's watching, because nobody is watching, and it's not going to matter. But it's not going to matter for the story that you're experiencing writer's block with, but it will matter in the sense that it'll help you get your creativity back and exercise that creativity so that you can then take that creativity and apply it to the story you were trying to tell from the get-go. So that kind of segues into the second point. My second tip for dealing with writer's block is working on a different story. So oftentimes writer's block is applied to one specific story that we're trying to tell. And whether you're writing a romance, a science fiction, a fantasy novel, doesn't matter. If you end up hitting a barrier, whether it's a fourth, half of the way through, 3/4 of the way through, sometimes all it takes to work your way through that writer's block is just to table it, put it to the side for a couple days, and just work on something completely unrelated. It goes hand in hand with utilizing story cubes and writing prompts, but really it's just about getting that creative mind, that creative portion of your brain to start spinning again. And oftentimes, whether it's subconsciously or indirectly, that will help you work your way through writer's block. I don't know what it is psychologically, but oftentimes if you can just get yourself to step away from the barrier that you're facing in whatever story it is that you're writing, and just work on something that is completely low stakes, something that no one out there is ever going to read because you're not going to do anything with it, but write a completely unrelated story that just makes you happy and that interests you, and that you're passionate about. And sometimes that will be enough to spark something in your mind to return to your original story renewed, rested, and with enough mental ammunition to plow through that writer's block. And sometimes the stories, the unrelated stories that you wrote, just for fun, will end up being applicable to your overall story. Don't go into it, with the intention that, oh, I'm going to write an unrelated story and then find a way to work it in to this original story. But sometimes, there have been times where I've used, unrelatable writing prompts while working through writer's block. And for whatever reason, years later, I'm working on a new story, and the prompt that I wrote off of from 3 to 5 years ago is a perfect scene for this new story I'm working on. And yeah, obviously I have to tweak elements of it. I have to change character names and settings, but the elements of this random story I wrote for fun end up being extremely applicable in this new story I'm telling, and it's just a win-win scenario. So yeah, whether it's in a journal or in a miscellaneous Google Doc, hold on to those stories that you work on for fun, because they may end up being extremely relevant in some story that you tell down the road. And anyway, I don't want to ramble too much, but that's my second tip, is working on another story. My third tip for working your way through writer's block is to go for walks, but to do so without stimuli. And what I mean by this is, don't be listening to music or podcasts or anything really, on these walks if you're taking these walks with the intention of overcoming writer's block. Now, everyone's different, so it's not going to be the same for everyone. Some people might be at their most creative mindset with music playing in their headphones while they're on a walk. Sure, that's fine. Don't take my advice then. Whatever works for you is what works for you. But I have witnessed in my own career, I found that when I go for these walks, I get much more out of them if I am just not listening to music, not listening to an audiobook or a podcast, but I'm just there, existing, listening to the sounds of nature. I go for daily walks with my dogs. When I am walking my dogs, if it's not for the purpose of overcoming writer's block or thinking about my story, then I will wear my headphones and I will listen to music, or I'll listen to audiobooks or whatever. But if I'm going with the intention on the walk to think about, okay, what do I do next in this story? What should this character do in this specific situation? What would they say? How would they react? Then I personally cannot have the distraction of a book or a song playing in my ears while I'm trying to think through those problems. Like I said, it varies for everyone. Not everyone is the same. That's what makes humanity awesome. You can get 20 writers together in a room and all of them will have different processes for how they overcome writer's block, obviously. But for me, this works because there is something about walking, just moving your body and creativity, that can stimulate your creativity by engaging different parts of the brain that can help reduce stress and allow your subconscious thoughts to surface. I'm not a scientist. I majored in religion and philosophy and criminal justice, so I am by no means an expert in understanding why that is, but I have witnessed it firsthand in my own life, and I know plenty of other artists and authors who have experienced it in their own careers. So, tip number 4 for overcoming writer's block is reading. And it sounds, pretty oversimplistic to say this, but reading, and I mean both fiction and nonfiction, can open up your mind to new perspectives, ideas, writing styles, and all of that will help you overcome blocks in your own writing. And so the reason I don't rule out nonfiction, as a fiction writer, it may sound weird to say that I also read nonfiction, but I have found that no matter what I'm reading, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, both genres or categories of genres will present things to me that are extremely helpful in helping me overcome writer's block. Let me explain. So, when I'm reading fiction, that will help me overcome writer's block because maybe I like the way that a certain writer or author writes their dialogue, or a certain way that they implement character development. And so I will, kind of latch on and learn from other authors that write fiction in how they place their characters in certain situations and then have those characters overcome those situations. And so I learn through, vicariously watching how these authors set up problems and have their characters solve those problems. But in nonfiction, the cool thing about nonfiction, even if it's, if it's historical nonfiction, if it's self-help nonfiction, no matter what, there are certain ideas or things you can learn and take away from nonfiction that you just can't get from fiction, from reading regular fantasy or science fiction or romance. And what I mean by that is, so I already stated that I will read fiction in order to observe how other fiction authors do certain things. But reading nonfiction can just help teach you facts or ideas that you never knew, and you can use those facts and ideas in your fiction. So maybe I'm reading a self-help book, and the author of that self-help book included a quote from Alexander the Great or some historical figure that I've never personally done a lot of reading on. And maybe that quote resonates with me. Maybe it sparks something in me where it's like, I think I could see my main character saying something like that. Or I think I could see my side character saying something awfully similar to that. And I don't mean that in the way of plagiarizing that. I mean, it will help influence decisions that you make about your characters in your story. It can also help teach you informative things about particular settings, on certain research that you didn't even know you needed for this book. I know a lot of science fiction authors, in their free time, they're not reading other science fiction. They're reading books on quantum mechanics and physics and astrophysics, not because, they want to learn string theory, but because it could be very applicable for the fiction that they do write. And so they want to read nonfiction so that they can learn those principles and apply them to their fiction. And so even if it's something as simple as self-help, a lot of self-help books, include historical lessons. They include quotes from historical figures. A lot of it ends up being extremely applicable to fiction because it can teach you things that you didn't know that will be informative to where you want your story to take place, how you want your characters to act, and just overall, we go to school until 12th grade, we graduate, and some people, if you didn't go to college or graduate school, then we stop learning. But nonfiction is the best way to, allow you to continue learning, take the things you learn and apply them to your writing, and that can ultimately help you overcome writer's block. So, last but not least, switching up the medium. What do I mean when I say this? So a lot of times when you are writing, you'll write your story in a particular software or just medium in general. So if you start your story in Microsoft Word or Google Docs, normally you will write the entire story in that software that you started it in. However, if you are struggling with writer's block, one of the biggest recommendations that I can make to you is to switch up the medium. You can leave that Word doc. You are not confined to writing only in that Word document. And I have found 80% of the time probably that I'm dealing with writer's block, if I just leave that software that the whole overall story is being written in and go somewhere else and write in a different space, that alone will help me get through writer's block. I write all of my first drafts in Google Docs, and if I get 250 pages into my Google Doc and I hit a barrier where I don't know where I want to take the story, I'll close the Google Doc and I will go to my Notes app on my laptop. As silly as that sounds, I will go to my Notes app on my laptop. I have a MacBook, so my Notes app is synchronized with my iPhone, and I will just make a new note and I'll start writing there, completely unattached from the Google Doc. I think sometimes just by seeing how much we've written in that Google Doc, for instance, looking and seeing that it's 250 pages, can be overwhelming to our subconscious mind. And so I'll just close out of it, go to the Notes app, and start writing my most recent or my newest chapter there. And I can always copy and paste what I've written in that note app back into the Google Doc. And the cool thing about the Notes app, in my opinion, is that I can do it on my phone too. So sometimes I'll close the laptop altogether and I'll be laying in bed at night, and if I'm not tired enough to sleep, I'll open up that new Notes app or that new note, tab, and I will just write on my phone as if I'm, we do it all the time. We text people all day long. I don't see any reason why I can't just continue writing my story on my phone. Or I will use my tablet and I will hand write with my stylus on my tablet in order to push through that writer's block. Or you don't need a tablet, you don't need a phone, you don't need a Notes app. You can just grab a legal pad or a journal and a pen or a pencil and start writing your next chapter in that different medium. And I find that something in us subconsciously allows us to continue working through the story if you just switch the medium, if you switch the method of where you are writing the story. And that also works for where you're physically present sometimes. So I do most of my writing from home with my dogs. But sometimes if I'm dealing with writer's block, I don't even have to close out of the Google Doc. Sometimes just by shutting my laptop, putting it in the bag, getting in the car and driving to the coffee shop, changing scenery, placing myself somewhere different physically allows me, for whatever reason, psychological or whatever, that allows me to continue writing the story. So in that sense, switching the medium, I don't mean that in a sense of, switching from Google Docs to notes or to writing it handwritten. I mean it switching the medium of where you are physically doing the writing. And so if you write at home in an office, pack up the computer, go to a coffee shop, go to a bookstore. I love going to Barnes & Noble and sitting in their coffee area, getting a coffee and just writing. And I'll write for an hour, and then I'll get up, I'll go browse some of the books. I'll, read a couple blurbs on the back of books that see if anything interests me. And then after taking that little bit of break for 15 minutes or so, I'll go sit back down in the coffee area and I'll write for another hour. Doesn't have to be a coffee shop. It can be a park. It could be, God, there are so many public places that allow you to bring your laptop into and just sit down and write. I've gone, this is going to sound weird. This is going to sound really weird actually, but I've gone and sat down in a Chick-fil-A and written. And the reason I did that is because I really had a hankering for Coke Zero, and I didn't have any Coke Zero at home. And so something in my mind about like a large Chick-fil-A styrofoam cup filled to the brim with ice and Coke Zero sounded so good. And Chick-fil-A, the inside of Chick-fil-A's are so clean. I was like, you know what? For like $1.80, I'll buy a Coke Zero and I'll go sit in a Chick-fil-A with my headphones on and I'll write. And that's what I did. So you can be as weird as you want when it comes to where you choose to do the writing, but I find that switching the medium, either where you're doing the writing or where you're physically oriented, can help you work your way through writer's block. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. I hope you maybe got something out of this. Feel free to leave in the comments any additional things that you would recommend that you've tried and I didn't mention. I think every writer ultimately has their own tried and true way of how to work through writer's block. I was listening to a podcast that had Pierce Brown on it. Pierce Brown is the author. He's a New York Times bestselling author for the science fiction series Red Rising. And when he was writing the third book in that series, he was talking about how crazy enough, he went and he bought a ticket to go into an isolation tank. It's like a sensory deprivation tank. It's those tanks where they're in most major cities, but if you don't know what it is, it's like an egg-shaped tank. You get in, it closes around you, and there is no noise. There's no light. It completely deprives all your senses. So you are literally, it feels like you're just a floating conscience. And he did that to help himself with writing one of his scenes in his third book, Morningstar, in the Red Rising series. So everyone has their own way of doing it, of getting through writer's block. But the beautiful thing to remember is you can and you will get through writer's block. But the only way to get through it is to work your way through it. Don't be passive. Don't sit back and convince yourself that it'll pass with time, because a lot of times it won't. A lot of times it takes work and initiative on your end and staying consistent to overcome writer's block. And so I hope these tips have been helpful. Again, those tips are utilizing story cubes or writing prompts, to go for walks, to work on different stories, to read nonfiction and fiction, and to switch up the medium. I feel like if you can implement any of those in your life while you're dealing with writer's block, you will be leaps and bounds ahead, and you'll be setting yourself up for success to work your way through writer's block continue hammering home on that story that you're working on and to get it into the hands of readers, because that's what it's all about, is getting your story out there, because there are people who want to read it and who, tragically, if you don't work your way through writer's block, never will get the opportunity to read it, because it'll end up being yet another unfinished story, and no one wants that. You don't want that as the writer, and your readers who support you don't want that. You'll end up being like George R.R. Martin or Patrick Rothfuss, who started series and pulled a bunch of readers in and then just never finished the series. And that is a letdown for those authors. I'm sure that they don't feel good about, doing that. But also for their readers who, put time, who invested their time in reading those stories and their money in reading those stories. So I won't ramble on anymore. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next episode of the Starving Artist podcast.